mortgage markets, and more. I'm your host, Peter D'Angelo. Welcome to Friday, everybody. I hope you all made it a great week. Before we head into the weekend, we've got a mixed bag episode for you today, just based upon what's been going on over the past couple weeks. So I'm going to make brief commentary on the actual real estate market and just a couple updates. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the mortgage rate environment, as that is certainly going to have an implication on the real estate market as we move forward here, because it's been a bit of a rocky road. So first and foremost, all of the expectations, and I've noticed that there's been more conversations happening lately about where are home prices going to go, where are home values going to be going in the next couple years. And I'm noticing a shift in mentality now, thinking more long-term about where real estate values could possibly go. With the lack of a crystal ball, I can only give you some scenarios that would create environments that would wind up being something that we'd be looking at seeing happen in reality. So the first thing I wanted to address was the rate environment. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, but for right now, where the rates are going to influence property values, because interest rates are what indicates buying power. We talked about in February, 34.5% of real estate transactions were all cash. Those buyers are insulated. However, there is only a certain amount of cash that people are going to be able to shop for as inflation continues to persist and things continue to be expensive. So first and foremost, the interest rate environment is going to be a factor in what long-term real estate value looks like. The second thing to note, we also need to be cognizant of distressed sales. We saw that tick up a little bit in February, just 0.1%, but in a couple minutes, you're going to understand the importance and how much 0.1% can possibly impact things. So from the perspective of distressed sales, that ticked up slightly. If we see more short sales, foreclosures, or pre-foreclosure sales, then we could possibly see some softening to real estate value. But what does softening look like in this current state of the economy and the real estate market, where values are they've been ripping higher for so long? Does a softening mean flattening or just less growth? In certain markets across the country right now, there are smaller pockets that are expecting, or there's at least forecasts from Case-Shiller, which is an online, a place where you can go and see analytics for forecasting. CoreLogic is another provider that reviews all of the data and analytics for home sales to create their forecasting. If we look at any of these, and then also Zillow, let's talk about that. Zillow has their own valuation metrics. If you look on Zillow, you see Zestimate. They've got their own valuation metrics built in there. And if we look across all of these, there are certain pockets that are showing softening and that possible home values could reduce. However, across most of the country, these home values are still expected to appreciate, definitely in the short term based on what these forecasts are looking like. But longer term, it's anybody's guess, because we still have this fight against inflation that is certainly impacting what buying power looks like, what home values are going to look like, what affordability looks like. The third thing to mention is, I said before, inflation. That's kind of a key point here. Where is inflation going to be going? And we want to see it cool. We want to see it reach that golden 2% target that we've been talking about so very much. But we're seeing now that it is taking a while for that to happen. And there's some bumps in the road, which we'll get into. So inflation, we're talking about distressed sales, and we're talking about the mortgage rate environment. So inflation, mortgage rate environment, kind of codependent in a sense, but they are separate things that when inflation is managed and we reach a 2% target, then the mortgage rate environment will be operating a little bit more on its own outside of what monetary policy is doing to influence mortgage rates. So we talked a lot about mortgage rates. We talked a lot about home values. Let's actually talk about where things are ending off. I'm recording this podcast on Thursday, so this is the latest and greatest as of Thursday this week. However, the expectations are things are going to remain consistent through the end of the week. So heading into the weekend, when you're shopping for a home, here's where things have settled in. And this is where I always like to have my PSA to encourage you to talk to your real estate professional and your, most importantly, actually, your mortgage professional about what your interest rate looks like right now after the recent changes. So the market has changed, and here's a run through of the Mortgage News Daily survey of mortgage rates across the country right now. The 30-year fixed rate mortgage now has gone up on average to 7.34%. The 30-year FHA mortgage is now up to 6.68%. The 30-year jumbo is at 7.5%. The 15-year fixed is at 6.75%. And the 7.6 SOFR adjustable rate mortgage, that's at 7%. Out of all of them, the adjustable rate mortgages are taking the brunt of it. This is due to how the market is reacting, particularly the bond market, which we've talked about in the past, that heavily influences interest rates. You can kind of think expectations for monetary policy from the Fed kind of create an environment that then the people who are actually actively investing in bonds use as a guide as to when to buy and sell. I'll give you just a brief, I don't want to bore you, so I'm going to try and make this as fun as possible. I'm going to give you an idea of how the bond market works. So we talk about it a lot, but I think it's important to understand, how does the bond market operate? Because obviously it's different than the equities or the stock market. That's where you're investing in individual companies or indexes of companies. As a disclaimer, this is not financial advice. This is just providing you information about how these markets operate. So if we're looking at the stock market, you're going to invest in a company. How you invest in that company is based upon your opinion of the company, speculation around the company, and the more people who are interested in buying it, the price rises. So the price of the stock goes up as there's more interest, as there's more value. In the bond market, it's comparable. So there's a supply and demand element. However, where the bonds are different are when you're investing in a bond, it has a fixed value based upon maturity. So you're buying, in this case, we're talking about U.S. Treasury bonds. This is the debt of the U.S. government that's being sold so that the U.S. government has funding for all of the things that the government needs to support. When you buy that bond, it has a fixed value at a certain timeline. So you can buy different timelines of bonds. We're just going to talk right now, because we're talking about the 7.6. We're going to just talk real quick about, let's say, something like the 10-year bond. You can buy the bond, and you will be paying a price for it based upon how competitive and how many other people want to buy that bond. So that's what drives the price up. Because it's a fixed output, it's a fixed amount of money you're going to get at the end, what that price is when you buy that bond will influence what we call the yield, how much money you're going to get back. For simplicity purposes, let's say the bond is worth $100. If there's not a lot of attention to buy that bond for whatever it may be, you can maybe buy that bond for $75. Your yield will be $25. That is 25%. Now, that's quite a bit there. There's a 25% difference. It's not common in what we see in the bond market, but I want to set this example up so you can understand how that operates. If there's a lot of attention, that bond is still $100 when it hits maturity, but if there's more people competing for it, the price goes up. So supply and demand economics, we see the price go up, which makes the yield go down because it's a fixed amount of money you're getting at maturity. Simply said, this is how the bond market operates. I'm bringing this to your attention because we talk about the 10-year bond every time we talk about mortgage rates. I gave you all of the mortgage rates. Here's where the 10-year bond is, which most closely is tied to the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. That's at 4.54% as of recording this podcast. We peaked last week at 4.42%. And then it pulled back. So that means there's less people investing in bonds. You're probably wondering, why are there less people investing in bonds? What changed? What happened? A couple things happened. Number one was last week, not this past week, but the week prior, we got really strong jobs data. We got a strong jobs report, which indicates strength in the economy. I mentioned last week this whole good news, bad news thing. Well, that's good news because the economy is strong. It's bad news because the Fed and Fed Chair Jerome Powell historically likes to see the job numbers soften because that normally indicates that the economy is softening up, and that normally paves the way for inflation to come down. With strong job gains, with strong wage gains, people have more money and they're more gainfully employed to spend money in the economy, which will then translate to higher inflation. How much money people pay is how much they're going to actually commit to buying these things at whatever prices they're at. So if prices continue to go up and they have the money to buy it, they're going to continue to buy. This is what creates this very complex and what many are calling a sticky inflation situation. In addition to the jobs report, this week, which we're going to now drill down into, we got the consumer price index. The consumer price index is another inflation gauge. We've talked in the past about the personal consumption expenditure. That's the Fed's preferred gauge. The consumer price index is another gauge that is widely accepted across analysts and across investors. This came in just a touch hotter than what we were expecting, and that's all that it takes right now. Just to show you how everything's hanging by a thread in a sense with what direction interest rates are going to go, what direction the Fed's going to go with their monetary policy. It just takes a little bit off of what we expect for it to start to create confusion. And I'll make comment at the end about the confusion that there has been this year to date, up through this week in April. Let's talk about the consumer price index. The CPI is what I'm going to call it. The headline, which is encompassing everything, that had a month-over-month increase of 0.4%. That was up from the estimate and anticipation of 0.3%, which was the consensus there. So just slightly higher than February, 0.1%, had tangible impact. As we talked about before, 0.1%, that's all it can take sometimes. Year over year was at 3.5% versus 3.4%. That was the consensus of expectation. Yet again, just a touch hotter across both of those. Now we're looking like, oh boy, inflation isn't making this downward trend, because most people looked at January and February and saw, okay, well, if inflation gets a little hotter, we're still getting some, information after retail sales and after people spending money during the holiday season. So all these things factor in. These numbers do get seasonally adjusted, but the point remains that now we've got 3 months in a row of hotter than expected inflation readings, which is certainly going to create complications for the Fed. And any discussions about a rate cut for the Fed fund rate is now being kicked even further out. Let's look a little bit deeper into the consumer price index, the CPI, because there's also, they peel away some data points to give you maybe a better idea of what certain parts of the economy look like from a price perspective. So this is now excluding food and energy. These two industries and markets are seen as volatile. So if we remove them, we could say, okay, well, this is where things are at when we take out of the accounting the things that are volatile that can have price spikes and drops within relatively short amounts of time. Month over month, that was up 0.4%, which was spot on the consensus. So the core is good there. The core year over year was at 3.8%, where the consensus was expecting it to be 3.7%. And even though that's just 0.1, yet again, just a little bit hotter, that's all it takes for people to start saying, well, it doesn't look like the Fed is going to cut this year, or the Fed's not going to cut 6 times like people thought going into 2024. Maybe the Fed's only going to cut 3 times. There seems to be more of a consensus now that the Fed may only cut 1 time, if any, this year. And it's due to these hotter inflation figures and other factors that influence where inflation will go. Let's look at housing. We talk about real estate. So this housing figure includes rental as well as people who own their primary residences. So housing is up month over month, 0.6%, and year over year, 5.7%. It's pretty comparative to the PCE, the personal consumption expenditure that we looked at last week when we had that information, which is the Fed's preferred gauge. It's showing that it's still more expensive, as we know from home prices. Those are continuing to rise. Though there are certain markets in the country where rents are going down and the cost for rent, there are the majority of urban markets that rents are continuing to rise. So this is influencing what that CPI figure is for housing and what we call shelter. The other one I wanted to alert you to was the services sector. Now, the U.S. economy at large, we are a 75% services economy. That means 75% of what we pay for is service as a U.S. consumer. It's an important thing to look at when we're looking at the inflation readings because so much of our money goes to services. So we're going to start here at the year over year number, which is up 5.4%, and month over month up 0.5%. So these prices continue to go up. Inflation is proving to be very difficult to come down and reach that 2% target by the Fed. This was all released earlier this week. This all happened on Wednesday. Thursday, as a recording of this podcast, we also got the producer price index. The PPI is what that's called. Now, the PPI isn't an inflation reading, as the CPI and PCE are. I know I've got a lot of acronyms here, but hang with me. There are other things that economists look at and analysts look at, like the producer price index, PPI, because it can give us a little bit of a sign, possibly, of where consumer prices are going to go in the following months. Because the PPI, producer price index, indicates wholesale prices. So the people who are selling you things, what they're getting at for wholesale, that's indicating this PPI, producer price index. And this one is actually a little bit of good news. It cooled off a little bit this morning. So the seasonally adjusted month over month is up 0.2%. And that's less than the 0.3% expectation. So that 0.1, we've seen it be meaningful for the CPI. Will it be as meaningful when people read the PPI today? Remains to be seen, but that's what we're looking at. And it's still lower than the 0.6% increase that there was month over month in February. So that's showing some good sign here that maybe inflation could start to cool a little bit, but these type of things lag. If we're getting PPI like this now, we've got maybe 30 to 60 days before that starts to translate into something that, is tangible and showing in our inflation reports. Not seasonally adjusted year over year, it's up 2.1%. So while that number isn't necessarily exactly like what we're looking at for quote unquote 2% inflation, this is just one small piece of the puzzle, at least that's starting to line up. So that's a good sign. Of that, we talked about services because services are very important. Services are up 0.3%. However, goods, the things you pay for, that's down 0.1%. That's how we got the reading of up 0.2% month over month. Services are still a little bit higher. It's the goods costs that have gone down that helps this reading, but seeing that services are continuing to be expensive indicate to us that this environment, this economy is still very strong, even though we saw the stock market take a little bit of a dip. Well, this is going to be a process. As we've talked about before, I don't think it was appropriate, in my opinion, for there to have been such a high expectation of 6 rate cuts. And you're probably wondering, like, Pete, why are we going through so much of this economic data? I'm not a financial advisor. That's not what I do. But all of this information we're talking about directly affects, in one way or another, where mortgage rates are going. And where mortgage rates go, so too goes home values, very possibly with longer term exposure in this, what I'll call, chaotic environment. It's very volatile. Putting all this together for you, right? We got to link up all these pieces to understand and make good decisions for ourselves. If you're a real estate professional, for your clients, if you're a consumer or a prospective home buyer, when you're making your decision to buy a home. We need to pull all this together. Let's look at it this way. We need inflation to go down to 2%. The Fed has made it very clear. Are rate cuts required to see lower interest rates? I'm leaving that up for you. What do you think? Think about this. We haven't seen much change. We saw a little bit hotter than what we were expecting over 3 months now. But the mortgage rates swung from the beginning of January, 6.5%, all the way up to now, 30-year fixed is at 7.34 on average across the country. Was there any change to the Fed fund rate when the rates went down? No. What made the rates go down? Expectation. Expectation of a Fed rate cut. The market needs to know that we're going to see the Fed rate cut, or at least have a confident indication for the mortgage rates to start to go down. That's going to be the first relief that we see. The first relief that we're going to see is if we start to see these inflation readings come down a little bit, then we'll be in a better position to see mortgage rates come down. The other thing to consider here, with this high rate environment that we've been in for a long time, the longer term exposure we have to this, the more we're all going to get used to what this is like. And when we get used to what this is like, it's going to be more baked in to our economy, our industries, and how much we're used to paying for things. There's a couple things that can maybe swing this in another direction. And it's important to note that credit cards and the use of credit is a factor here. You do not necessarily need to have the money in the bank to spend. That's what credit has created in this country, in the history of the country. So if you are overextending on credit, you're continuing to buy. Well, you're continuing to buy, prices will stay elevated. There could be a world where the U.S. consumer at large reaches their capacity. They're completely overextended. Now what happens in that environment? Well, some things that can happen. One, foreclosures, pre-foreclosures, short sales, what we talked about at the top of the episode. Those are things that can happen so people could bail out of their property, wipe their debt clean. Other things that can happen, people could start falling behind on their mortgage payments. Now that starts to limit the pool if you wanted to buy another house or you wanted to move up, selling your home, and now that can create a struggle and a hurdle for you. Overextension on credit is a very difficult thing to manage for most because this economy and I guess it's more of our society has felt more comfortable with having debt than generations past. So the more comfortable we are with debt, the more likely we are as consumers to overextend. I'm painting with a broad stroke. There are still a number of people who hate debt. They do not want to have debt hanging over them. Good on you for that. That's amazing. But when we see prices continue to go up, not necessarily a one-to-one increase in household incomes, modest gains are still happening, but not comparatively to the price increases. And when we were looking at year over year, let's also remember this year over year is looking back a year ago, which already saw another 2%. We're talking about significant price increases when we look longer term over the past 3 years since inflation peaked. So taking into account all these things, it's really important to keep our eye on all of these metrics because they are directly affecting real estate mortgage rates. As far as outlook looking forward, I made the point of comparing January and where we had lower interest rates to now where we've got the higher interest rates tickling almost 7.5% for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Well, expectations are what created this. So understand that as expectations are not met, mortgage rates are going to continue to be volatile. So from now, moving forward to the rest of the year, I would strongly suggest continuing to have close communication with your mortgage professional. Reach out to me, call me anytime. You can text me, find me on socials, but reach out to me if you want some more insight on this or if you need someone that's going to keep you up to date and in the loop. Because as these rates change, your buying power changes. For you realtor professionals out there, your client's buying power will change as time goes on and as this market proves to be volatile. That's a significant amount of buying power in the change from 7% to 7.34%. And that was just in a week. So when you're going out to shop this weekend, definitely call your mortgage professional, check in and say, hey, am I still good to shop at 500,000, 550, 600? What should my budget now be? What does my qualification look like with this new rate environment? That's it for me today. I know it was a data dump and there's a lot of information there, but I hope that you found this helpful and useful. As I mentioned, the situation is extremely fluid. We're going to see what transpires as far as Fed policy, interest rates, the Fed fund rate. But for right now, we just got to hang in there. We're going to have relief again at some point, but this just proves that this is going to take time and that we cannot take overwhelming optimism. We need to approach with mild optimism and mild skepticism in a healthy balancing dose so that we can manage ourselves accordingly and appropriately. I look forward to giving you all another mortgage update on Monday, where we're going to talk a little bit more about some facets of mortgages and some maybe tips and tricks to manage this more volatile environment. Until then, have yourself an awesome weekend, and I look forward to talking to you on Monday. Take good care.